The spring of 1945 brought more than just the end of war to the towns and villages scattered across Germany. It brought something far more unsettling than defeat itself. For 12 years, the people had been fed a carefully constructed narrative about who their enemies were. They had been told stories, shown images, and taught to believe that certain people were less than human. The propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to paint a picture of the world that justified every horror, every law, every act of violence committed in the name of the Reich. But when American forces rolled through the rubble of German streets, when the tanks stopped and the soldiers stepped out, when orders were given in accented English and commands were issued with authority, something happened that no amount of indoctrination had prepared the civilians for. The faces behind those helmets, the men giving the orders, the officers in charge of occupation zones, many of them were the very people the Reich had taught Germans to despise. They were Jewish, and they were in control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For the ordinary German citizen, this revelation hit like a cold wave. Everything they thought they understood about power, about superiority, about the natural order of the world was turned completely upside down. The shock was not just political. It was personal, visceral, and deeply disorienting. How could the people they had been told were weak, scheming, and unworthy now stand before them as victors, as liberators, as the ones holding the future of Germany in their hands? The citizens of towns like Würzburg, Mannheim, and Darmstadt had lived through years of rationing, bombing raids, and propaganda broadcasts. By the time the Americans arrived in April and May of 1945, most were simply exhausted. They had grown used to the sound of artillery in the distance, the sight of refugees clogging the roads, and the whispered rumors that the war was lost. Yet even in their weariness, they carried the weight of years of indoctrination. Jewish people, they had been taught, were the source of Germany's problems. They were portrayed as shadowy manipulators, cowards who hid behind others, people incapable of true strength or leadership. Posters had plastered the walls, films had filled the cinemas, children had learned it in school. It was woven into the fabric of daily life so deeply that many Germans no longer even questioned it. It had simply become truth. So when the first American jeeps rolled into the town square of a place like Heidelberg, and when German civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and shelters, they expected to see what they had been told to expect. Perhaps they imagined brash, undisciplined soldiers. Maybe they thought the Americans would be careless or arrogant. What they did not expect was to hear a commander bark orders in German with a slight Yiddish inflection, or to see a captain wearing a Star of David pendant beneath his uniform, or to stand before an officer whose last name was clearly Steinberg, Goldman, or Rosenthal. The initial encounters were loaded with confusion. In the rubble-strewn streets of Frankfurt, a middle-aged woman approached an American officer to ask about food rations. She spoke haltingly in broken English, her hands shaking, her eyes downcast. The officer responded fluently in German, his accent unmistakably that of someone who had grown up speaking the language. When she looked up, startled, he smiled faintly and said, "Yes, I am Jewish, and yes, I am your new military governor." The woman stood frozen, unable to process what she had just heard. She had expected anger, perhaps. She had expected punishment, but she had not expected this calm, this authority, this quiet dignity from someone she had been taught to see as beneath her. In Darmstadt, a baker named Helmut recounted a similar moment years later in an interview. American soldiers had occupied the town hall, and notices were posted requiring all residents to register with the new administration. Helmut went to comply, clutching his papers, his stomach tight with dread. The officer behind the desk was a man in his 30s, trim and professional, with dark eyes and a calm demeanor. When Helmut stammered his name, the officer looked up and replied in flawless German, "Relax, Herr Müller. We are here to rebuild, not to destroy." And then he introduced himself. "I am Lieutenant Benjamin Kaplan. My family left Berlin in 1938. They held the power of life and death in a country that had tried to erase them. But the shock was not limited to authority alone. It extended to behavior. German civilians, conditioned by years of hate-filled propaganda, expected the Jewish officers to be vengeful. They braced for cruelty, for humiliation, for retribution. After all, would not any group of people, having suffered what the Jews had suffered, come back with rage in their hearts? Would they not use their newfound power to inflict pain in return? Yet what unfolded in town after town defied those expectations. The Jewish officers were firm, yes. They were strict about order and discipline. But they were not sadistic. They did not gloat. They did not parade their authority with cruelty. Instead, they carried themselves with a quiet professionalism that left the German civilians even more bewildered. In the town of Wiesbaden, Captain Samuel Lowenstein was assigned to oversee the distribution of medical supplies. The local hospital had been bombed, and resources were scarce. German doctors and nurses, many of whom had served under the Nazi regime, now found themselves taking orders from a Jewish officer. At first, they could barely meet his eyes. They fumbled with their words, unsure how to address him. Lowenstein noticed, but said nothing. He simply organized the supply chain with efficiency, ensured the injured were treated regardless of their background, and worked 18-hour days to keep the hospital running. One of the German nurses later wrote in her diary, "I do not understand this man. He has every reason to hate us, yet he works as though he is saving his own people, not ours." That paradox, that unsettling contrast between expectation and reality, became the defining feature of the occupation for many German civilians. They had been taught that Jewish people were weak, yet here were Jewish officers commanding entire districts with authority and competence. They had been told that Jews were vengeful conspirators, yet here were Jewish men distributing food, rebuilding infrastructure, and enforcing laws with fairness. The propaganda had painted them as something less than human. But now, face to face, the civilians saw men who were disciplined, educated, and in many cases, more humane than the regime they had once served. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some Germans tried to rationalize it. Perhaps these were different Jews, they whispered. Perhaps the Americans had simply chosen the best among them. Others clung to the old beliefs, insisting that this was all part of a larger conspiracy. But for many, especially the younger generation, the experience planted seeds of doubt. If the propaganda had lied about this, what else had been a lie? In the city of Stuttgart, a school teacher named Greta found herself face-to-face with Major David Friedman, who had been tasked with reopening schools and vetting teachers for Nazi affiliations. Greta had taught history under the Reich, and her textbooks had been filled with anti-Semitic content. She knew her record was not clean. When she was called to his office, she expected to be dismissed, perhaps even arrested. Instead, Friedman asked her a simple question. "Do you believe what you taught?" Greta hesitated, then quietly admitted, "I do not know anymore." Friedman nodded. "Then you will relearn, and then you will teach the truth." He allowed her to keep her job under supervision, with the condition that she attend re-education sessions. Years later, Greta would say that moment was the first time she truly questioned everything she had been taught. Not because Friedman had punished her, but because he had given her a chance. These interactions were not isolated. Across occupied Germany, Jewish officers found themselves in positions of authority over the very population that had supported, or at least tolerated, the regime that sought to annihilate them. And time and again, they chose professionalism over vengeance. They chose order over chaos. They chose to rebuild rather than destroy. For the German civilians, this was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. The enemy they had been taught to fear and despise was not interested in revenge. They were interested in justice, in stability, and in moving forward. This did not mean the officers were soft. Discipline was enforced. War criminals were prosecuted. Nazis were removed from positions of power. But the everyday interactions, the small moments of civility and fairness, those were what truly unsettled the population. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A Jewish lieutenant helping an elderly German woman carry her groceries. A Jewish captain organizing a soup kitchen for starving children regardless of their parents' politics. A Jewish colonel sitting down with a group of German farmers to discuss crop rotation and food security. These were not the actions of the monsters the propaganda had described. These were the actions of men committed to restoring order and humanity. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. For years, German civilians had lived in a world where their identity, their sense of superiority, had been built on the dehumanization of others. The collapse of that worldview was not just a political shift, it was an existential crisis. Who were they if everything they had believed was a lie? What did it mean that the people they had been taught to despise were now the ones rebuilding their country? And perhaps most troubling of all, what did it say about them that they had believed the lies in the first place? In the town of Freiburg, an elderly man named Otto watched as a Jewish officer named Lieutenant Isaac Brenner coordinated the clearing of rubble from the main street. Otto had lost his son in the war. He had spent years listening to speeches about the greatness of the Reich and the threats posed by its enemies. Now, standing in the ruins of his hometown, he watched as a Jewish man, whose family had likely suffered unimaginable horrors, worked to restore the very streets Otto had walked as a child. Otto later confessed to a neighbor, "I do not know what to think anymore. The world I knew is gone, and the people I thought I understood, I do not understand at all." That confusion, that profound disorientation was shared by countless German civilians in the months following the surrender. They were not just witnessing the end of a regime, they were witnessing the collapse of an entire belief system. And standing in the center of that collapse were Jewish officers, calm, competent, and undeniably in control. For some, it was the beginning of a long journey toward understanding and reconciliation. For others, it was simply too much to process. But for all of them, it was a shock they would never forget. The people they had been taught to see as weak were now the ones holding the power, and they were wielding it with a dignity that shattered every lie the Reich had ever told. As the weeks turned into months, the presence of Jewish officers in positions of command became an inescapable reality for German civilians. What had initially registered as shock began to evolve into something more complex. Daily life under occupation meant constant interaction, constant reminders that the world had fundamentally shifted. The men and women who had once been targets of state-sponsored hatred were now the ones issuing ration cards, approving travel permits, and making decisions that affected every aspect of civilian existence. This was not a temporary arrangement. This was the new normal. In the city of Nuremberg, a place heavy with symbolic weight given its role as the site of Nazi rallies, the transformation was particularly stark. The grand stadium, where hundreds of thousands had once gathered to cheer for the Führer, now stood empty and silent. American forces had taken control of the city, and among the officers overseeing the occupation was Colonel Arthur Greenbaum, a man whose parents had emigrated from Munich in 1936. Greenbaum had grown up in New York speaking German at home, and he returned to Bavaria not with rage, but with a steely determination to dismantle what remained of Nazi infrastructure. German officials who had once held power now found themselves sitting across from him in requisitioned offices, answering questions about their roles during the war. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. One such encounter involved a former city administrator named Friedrich Vogel. Vogel had been a mid-level bureaucrat, not a party zealot, but certainly complicit in the machinery of the state. When he was summoned to meet with Colonel Greenbaum, he arrived with sweating palms and a rehearsed defense. Greenbaum listened quietly as Vogel explained that he had only followed orders, that he had no choice, that he had never personally harmed anyone. When Vogel finished, Greenbaum leaned back in his chair and said simply, "My mother used to buy bread from a bakery 2 streets from here. The owner knew her, knew she was Jewish. One day, in 1935, he refused to serve her.
Not because of a law, because he wanted to. Do you understand what I am telling you, Herr Vogel? Vogel nodded mutely. Greenbaum continued. You had choices. You always had choices. Now you will live with them. Vogel was removed from his position, but not arrested. It was a moment of accountability delivered without venom, and it left Vogel shaken in a way that mere punishment might not have. Across Germany, similar scenes unfolded in countless offices, town halls, and checkpoints. Jewish officers were not just enforcing military law, they were confronting German civilians with the consequences of their complicity. But what made these confrontations so psychologically jarring for the Germans was the restraint with which they were conducted. The officers did not shout, they did not threaten, they simply asked questions, documented answers, and made decisions based on evidence.
For people who had expected fury and retribution, this clinical professionalism was unsettling. It forced them to confront their guilt, not through violence, but through reflection. In the town of Kassel, a Jewish officer named Captain Leon Fischer was assigned to oversee the redistribution of housing. The bombing had left thousands homeless, and space was scarce. Fischer's job was to determine who would be allowed to remain in intact homes and who would be relocated to temporary shelters. Many of the homes still standing had belonged to Jewish families before the war, families who had been deported or murdered. Now, German families occupied those spaces. Fischer walked through these homes with a translator, examining records, asking questions. In one house, he found a family of 5 living in what had once been the residence of a Jewish doctor. The current occupants, a woman named Ilse and her children, had moved in during 1943 after the doctor and his family disappeared. Ilse was terrified when Fischer arrived. She expected to be thrown out immediately. Instead, Fischer asked her a single question. "Did you know who lived here before you?" Ilse hesitated, then nodded. Fischer looked around the room, at the furniture that had likely belonged to the previous owners, at the photographs that had been removed from the walls. "You will stay for now," he said quietly, "but you will remember whose home this was. And one day, if any of them survive, you will answer for it." Ilse broke down in tears, not from relief, but from shame. Fischer left without another word. These moments of moral reckoning were happening everywhere. Jewish officers were not simply occupiers. They were living reminders of what had been done. Their mere presence forced Germans to reckon with the human cost of the ideology they had supported or tolerated. And because the officers conducted themselves with such professionalism, there was no easy way for the civilians to deflect blame. They could not claim they were being treated unjustly. They could not point to abuse or cruelty. They were being held accountable within a framework of law and order, and that made the reckoning all the more piercing. But not all interactions were heavy with judgment. In some cases, the relationships that developed between Jewish officers and German civilians revealed surprising layers of humanity. In the small town of Rothenburg, a place that had survived the war relatively intact, a young Jewish lieutenant named Tobias Klein was assigned to liaise with local farmers to organize food distribution. Tobias had lost his entire family in the camps. His parents, his younger sister, his grandparents, all gone. He had every reason to hate the people he now worked among. Yet, he chose a different path. He met with farmers, listened to their concerns about planting seasons and equipment shortages, and worked to ensure that the harvest would be sufficient to feed both the occupation forces and the civilian population. One farmer, an older man named Johann, was initially suspicious and hostile. He resented taking orders from a Jew. But over the course of several weeks, as Tobias proved himself fair and competent, Johann's attitude began to shift. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Johann offered Tobias a cup of ersatz coffee. They sat in silence for a while before Johann finally spoke. "I do not understand you," he said. "After everything, why do you help us?" Tobias looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Because if I let hatred decide my actions, then they win. The people who did this, they wanted us to become like them. I refuse." Johann had no response. He simply nodded,
and looked away. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was the beginning of understanding. Stories like Tobias and Johann's were not common, but they were not rare either. Throughout occupied Germany, there were moments where the rigid lines of victim and perpetrator, occupier and occupied, blurred into something more complex. Jewish officers who chose mercy over vengeance, German civilians who began to question the beliefs they had held over a decade. In the city of Munich, a Jewish officer named Major Simon Adler was tasked with reopening cultural institutions. Museums, theaters, and concert halls had been shuttered or destroyed. Adler, who had been a violinist before the war, believed that culture was essential to rebuilding a moral society. He organized performances, art exhibitions, and lectures, many of which were open to German civilians. At first, attendance was sparse. Germans were wary of events organized by the occupiers, especially Jewish ones. But slowly, people began to attend.
They came partly out of curiosity, partly out of a desperate need for normalcy. One evening, Adler himself performed in a small concert at a repaired theater. He played Bach, a composer beloved by Germans, and the audience sat in stunned silence. When the final note faded, there was no applause at first. Then slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Within moments, the entire theater was applauding. Adler stood on stage, tears streaming down his face, not from joy, but from the weight of it all. After the performance, an elderly German woman approached him. She was crying. "I did not know," she whispered. "I did not know what they took from us." Adler looked at her and said gently, "Now you know. Do not forget." These cultural moments became powerful tools of transformation. Through music, art, and literature, Jewish officers were able to communicate something that orders and regulations could not. They were able to show German civilians that the people they had been taught to hate were not abstract enemies, but human beings with talents, emotions, and dignity. It was one thing to be told that the propaganda was false. It was another to witness the truth performed on a stage or displayed in a gallery. Education also played a critical role. Jewish officers were heavily involved in the denazification program, which aimed to remove Nazi ideology from German society. Schools were reopened, but only after curricula were completely rewritten. Textbooks that had glorified the Reich and demonized Jews were burned. New materials emphasized democracy, human rights, and the truth about the war. Many of the officers overseeing this process were themselves educators before the war, and they approached the task with a mix of determination and hope. In a school in Hamburg, a Jewish officer named Lieutenant Rachel Goldstein worked with German teachers to develop new lesson plans. Rachel had been a school teacher in Berlin before fleeing to England in 1939. Now she was back, not as a refugee, but as an authority. She sat in classrooms and observed lessons, offering feedback and corrections. One day, she watched as a teacher stumbled through a lesson on the Holocaust, clearly uncomfortable. After class, Rachel pulled the teacher aside. "I know this is difficult," she said, "but you must teach it. Not because I say so, but because those children deserve the truth." The teacher, a woman named Marguerite, nodded but looked pained. "How do I teach them that their parents were wrong, that their country was wrong?" Rachel met her eyes and said gently, "Now you know. Do not forget." Marguerite later said that conversation changed her approach. She stopped seeing the lessons as punishment and started seeing them as an opportunity. As the months wore on, the shock that German civilians initially felt began to give way to a grudging respect. They had expected the Jewish officers to be angry, vindictive, and incompetent. Instead, they found them to be disciplined, fair, and often remarkably skilled. The roads were being repaired, food was being distributed, schools were reopening. The officers were not just occupying Germany, they were rebuilding it, and they were doing so with an efficiency and competence that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the collapsing Reich. For many Germans, this was a bitter pill to swallow. It meant acknowledging that the people they had been taught to despise were in fact more capable and more humane than the leaders they had followed. In the industrial city of Essen, a Jewish officer named Walter Stern oversaw the reopening of a steel factory. The factory had been bombed heavily,
and much of the equipment was damaged. Stern, who had been an engineer before the war, worked with German foremen to assess what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced. At first, the foremen were reluctant to take orders from him, but as Stern demonstrated his expertise, their resistance faded. He knew the machinery.
He understood the processes. He solved problems that had stumped them. Within weeks, the factory was producing again, providing jobs for hundreds of Germans who desperately needed work. One foreman, a man named Klaus, later admitted, "I hated him at first, hated everything he stood for. But he saved our jobs, he saved our families. I cannot hate a man who does that." These practical successes had a profound impact on German attitudes. Ideology could be argued, philosophy could be debated, but results were undeniable. The Jewish officers were getting things done. They were restoring order, feeding people, and rebuilding infrastructure. For a population that had been living in chaos and despair, this was more persuasive than any speech or pamphlet. It was proof, tangible and immediate, that the people they had been taught to see as inferior were, in many ways, superior to those who had led them into ruin. Yet, the transformation was not universal. There were still Germans who clung to their hatred, who saw the presence of Jewish officers as an insult, a humiliation that confirmed their sense of victimhood. In some towns, resistance to the occupation took subtle forms. Shopkeepers refused to serve Jewish officers. Children were taught by their parents to avoid them. Graffiti appeared on walls, crude and hateful. But these acts of defiance were met with firm consequences. The occupation forces made it clear that anti-Semitism would not be tolerated. Those who engaged in it faced fines, imprisonment, or loss of ration privileges. The message was clear. The old ways were gone. This was a new Germany, and hatred had no place in it. For the Jewish officers themselves, the experience of returning to Germany in this capacity was deeply complex. Many had fled as refugees, stripped of everything, their families torn apart or murdered. Now they were back, wearing the uniform of a victorious army, holding power over the very people who had cheered their destruction. Some found it empowering, others found it painful. A few struggled with the temptation to abuse that power, though most resisted. They understood that how they conducted themselves would define not just the occupation, but also the memory of what had been lost. They were not just soldiers, they were witnesses, survivors, and in some cases, the last living links to communities that had been erased. One officer, Major Benjamin Hirsch, kept a journal during his time in Germany. In it, he wrote about walking through the streets of Frankfurt, the city where he had been born and from which he had been driven in 1938. He described standing in front of his childhood home, now occupied by strangers, and feeling a mix of sorrow and rage. But he also wrote about choosing not to knock on the door, not to confront the occupants. What would it achieve, he wrote. They are living in a grave. Let them stay there. I have moved on. It was a choice many Jewish officers made, to focus on the future rather than dwell in the past, to build rather than destroy, to prove through their actions that they were more than the victims the Nazis had tried to make them. As 1945 turned into 1946, the reality of the occupation had settled into a routine. German civilians had adapted to the new order. The shock had faded, replaced by a wary coexistence. The Jewish officers continued their work, rebuilding a shattered nation while carrying the weight of unimaginable loss. The relationships that formed during this time were complicated, marked by guilt, resentment, respect, and in rare cases, genuine connection. But one thing was undeniable. The presence of Jewish officers in positions of authority had forced an entire population to confront the lies they had been told and the horrors those lies had enabled. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. But it was a beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.